Okay, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I guess it is. And let's start off again, if we can, with mentioning what you are hopefully already engaged in doing, and that is about your term paper. Uh, it counts 20% of your grade, so please give it some attention. It's 800 words. Uh, not very long, but enough hopefully for you to be able to select an example of what is regarded as verbal art. And that is can be a poem, a movie script, an extract from a novel, speech, song, etc. All right. And some of you have been contacting me, emailing me with what you are planning to do, and what I've been pleased to see that you've been giving it thought and some good ideas, and looking forward to what you'll be writing. You do, this is an important point that I do want to emphasize. You do need to cite sources to support the claim that readers, listeners value your selected example as indeed verbal art. All right, some kind of verbal art. And yes, it can, as we have seen, Darwin's Origin of Species would be regarded as a kind of verbal art as well. And the kinds of speeches that we've looked at that inspire would also be a kind of verbal art. There is an art to it, there's a craft to it. But I do want you to find sources that support the claim that it is indeed something that is highly valued. And I want you to also, another important point, and that is to discuss and illustrate with examples to show how language and metaphor have contributed to this positive evaluation. This course is about language, and it's about how language is used in verbal art, invention, inspiration, and so forth. So it is important for you to be looking at what is language, what role does it play, and of course, a very important aspect of verbal art, as we have seen, is the ability to metaphorize, to make metaphors. So both of these aspects I will expect you to be looking for and paying attention to, discussing and illustrating as part of your term paper. That's due on Friday, the 4th of December, and that will be at the end of review week. So please be thinking about that and hopefully beginning to consider what you've got to write about and start writing. The other thing that I'd like you to be paying attention to, and this will be your final continuous participation task. This is the 4th one, and this is the last one. And this will be due on Friday, the 20th of November. Again, what we'll be talking about today will be helpful to you in doing this particular continuous participation task. So this is what it is. With reference to our discussion of examples of commencement motivation speeches, such as was given by Steve Jobs, David Foster Wallace, Denzel Washington, Susan Rice. I'll be mentioning more about these today, by the way, as I just said. Identify and discuss some typical linguistic features of commencement motivation speeches. So I'm enlarging it. It's because commencement speeches are very much usually a kind of motivation speech, and specifically targeting graduates in their graduation ceremony. But of course, motivation speeches represent a wider genre, which include very often commencement speeches. All right, so be looking at, again, what are typical linguistic features? What might you consider to be typical about a commencement or a motivation speech? So this is your last continuous participation task, 150 to 200 words, Friday, 20th of November. Now, here I'm just going to show you what were the final exam questions from last time I taught this course last semester. It was last academic year. And these were the final exam questions that I used. Now, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to sort of begin to, within the context of talking more about commencement motivation speeches, I'm going to be also trying to review in a way and try to relate it so that you can see how what we've been talking about throughout the semester is sort of being brought to bear on the kinds of texts that we're talking about today. So I'd like to talk about it, sort of frame this within these final exam questions. Now let me just go through them. Explain the linguistic notion of register as presented in this course. Discuss and illustrate with examples from lecture how the linguistic notion of register helps to explain how one evaluates the speaker's, writer's use of language in a given situation. The second question was, explain the linguistic notions of interpersonal meaning and modality as presented in this course, and discuss and illustrate with examples from lecture how one's use of modality may contribute to interpersonal meaning. And third, finally, explain the linguistic notions of theme and thematic progression as presented in this course, and discuss and illustrate with examples from lecture how the linguistic notions of theme and thematic progression may contribute to the listener's response to the speaker and writer. All right, now what I hope you're sort of putting through your mind right now is, well, how would I answer these questions and what is this about? And that is sort of, well, something that I want to sort of focus on today as well. So let's take that first one. Explain the linguistic notion of register. What is register? And taking this linguistic notion of register, explain and evaluate the speaker's, writer's use of language in a given situation. So then what is register? Remember, register is an important concept in linguistics, especially in the linguistic framework that I work in, and that is systemic functional linguistics. And it sort of links the idea of context and lexicogrammar, wording, how we speak, how we write. And it's not every sort of model of linguistics takes this into consideration, but register is an important aspect. And what is register? What is register? It's basically saying that how you perceive the situation, and in terms of, and three concepts that we'll talk about, field, tenor, and mode. How you perceive the situation is going to activate a choice of certain meanings. How you're going to express yourself, how you're going to speak, how you are also going to be understood. So the choices that you make with respect to how you make meaning are going to be influenced by the context of situation. And we describe the context of situation in terms of field, tenor, and mode. Now, it also works this way, that the choices that you make that are activated form something of a variety of language, and that variety of language in that which is typically spoken in that context of situation, that is called a register. Okay, so the context, as we just saw, activates certain choices. And these choices about how you're going to make meaning are realized by certain wordings. Those wordings, those meaning word choices that have been activated by the context of situation then form this variety, this expected sort of anticipated way of speaking in that context of situation. So we've been talking about context of situation as though it's something that we can define. Well, to some extent, yes, we can. Now, you'll remember I introduced this before. Hassan talks about action, relation, and contact. Sort of three domains of experience, of how we experience the world. We think about it in terms of action. What is going on? We think about it in terms of who is acting with whom and how they have been brought into contact with one another. Action, relations, contact. And this is something which is part of our history. It's part of our experience within the community. It's how we behave, and it's likely to be making how we will behave in the future. It's sort of seeing language and how language is carried out depending on the action, depending on who's acting with whom, depending on how they've been brought into contact. Now, take that sort of more general way of looking at human experience and then now look at it in terms of language. And in that sense, we are talking about field, tenor, mode. Think about language spoken in terms of situation, and that situation understood in terms of, well, what's going on? In terms of language, what is being talked about? What are you talking about? In terms of relations, that is realized in language by who is talking to whom. Who are those that are engaged in this exchange, this dialogue? And finally, if we say how the action is being carried, how those who are interacting, how they've been brought into contact, how does that happen? Well, how is that activity taking place within the context of this exchange, this idea of an exchange, the mode? What is being talked about? Field. Who is talking to whom? Tenor. How is the activity taking place? Mode. Now, you remember we brought up this when we looked at the judge's summation of evidence in that court case that we looked at. And we were looking at it in terms of, well, was the judge speaking too fast? Well, go back to take a look at what was the judge doing in this context, in that particular context of that the judge was summing up evidence. Now, as we said, in a courtroom, in that situation, there are different kinds of activities that take place. And this was one such activity. This is the judge summing up the evidence. What is being talked about will require the use of specialized legal terms. And the receivers then, the jury, the translator, they have to be familiar with those specialized legal terms. We said that the judge was reading the summation to the jury, and the interpreter is translating for the defendant. Those are sort of the relations. The judge is reading, the jury is supposed to be listening. The interpreter is supposed to be translating. Now, in this case, it was a problem because the interpreter was inexperienced. Didn't even know that if he had a question or if he wasn't sure, he could ask the judge to repeat and clarify. Mode. It was a written statement being read aloud. So what kind of mode was that? That was basically that was scripted speech. And it went on for on one day, more than an hour, another day, 2 hours. And because it is something written, it carries a high information load. Lexically dense, we say. A lot of content words packed into each clause. There would be a substantial amount of technical jargon. This goes back to what is being talked about, field. Because it is written, because of the mode, there would be complex grammatical constructions requiring considerable mental alertness, language proficiency in order to process it, to comprehend it. Field. what was being talked about. The judge was summing up the evidence. Tenor, the judge is reading it to the jury, and the mode, it's a written statement being read aloud. Now, another instance, when we say, what does it mean to speak presidentially or not? And we looked at the speech of Trump. Now, what does that mean to speak presidentially? It means that for someone in that role, how are they expected to speak? On what kinds of occasions are we talking about? Is it depend on, and as we saw, there were different times in which we could look at Trump's kinds of speaking. We looked at it in terms of his speech to Congress, which was very different than his speech when he went to the CIA headquarters. And in that speech, we noticed how it was not considered presidential. But in his speech to Congress, yes, it fit people's expectation. What was there about that situation? What is the register that he seemed to, when he spoke like a president? What was that register? That was how someone in that role, being president, in that role of being in government, is supposed to expected to speak in a public address. But Trump was very varied. And we noticed that, in fact, when we looked at his speech to the CIA headquarters, and it was largely about I and what he thought and what he said. Very different than his speech to Congress, which was considered presidential, where it wasn't so much about I. It wasn't so much about first person. It was first person plural, we. The nature of what is expected in that context. It's not expected a president is going to be talking about himself, what he thinks, what he says. Then it was considered to be too, as though he is just thinking about himself. So we draw conclusions from that because it didn't fit our expectations. It didn't fit the register for how a president is supposed to sound. There are other aspects also in terms of how the speech is put together in terms of logical structure, parataxis, hypotaxis. We saw that his speech to Congress fit what we see in Nixon's second inaugural or Obama's speeches. There are exceptions. The speech to the CIA was an exception. There was almost half-half, 50-50, parataxis and hypotaxis. The departure speech for Nixon, we saw the difference between that and his resignation speech, which we looked at last time. The resignation speech was obviously scripted, obviously written out, obviously planned ahead of time. The departure speech, he just was speaking extemporaneously. He was just speaking on the spot. And whatever came to his mind, that's what he said. But it's reflected in the way that we combine, the way we expand the text, whether we just sort of link ideas sequentially one after another, or whether we develop the ideas. And this was his departure speech. So last time, and this relates, when I talk about spoken versus written, I'm speaking about mode. This is the mode of discourse. And what we said was written technical discourse. It's characterized by simple clause and sentence structures. How come? Why is it that written is simple clause and sentence structures? Why? Because typically the clause just consists of two nominal groups that are with a verb in between that relates the two of them. And those nominal groups are long and complex with heavy post-modification and embedding that describes what's the nouns. So the lexical material is compressed into these two nominal groups that make up essentially a simple clause. Spontaneous speech, the spoken language, well, there we just sort of tend to go on, and we our thoughts are linked usually very often with like a conjunction like and or but. That's paratactic. Written language, we said, gains power by its density, lexical density, content, information load. Spoken language, power by its intricacy. We just can connect, expand ideas, and how we expand those ideas. And I gave you this example last time. I talked about this as being, it is a simple clause. Simple grammatically. Two noun phrases. The one here in blue, the other in red. And in between, a verb. And what's the nature of that verb? It is the verb to have. It's a relational process. This is typical for written language. And we notice that this involved embedding and grammatical metaphor, turning the verbs into nouns. This is typical of written language, the written mode. I'll take this example that you see on the screen. Take a moment to read it. All right, is this something that someone was speaking about, talking about, or something that someone wrote? Is it typical of speaking, or is it typical of writing? Well, what are the features that we observe? Frequent use of embedding. I highlight these in green. What is now understood as postmodernism? What Sontag calls a new sensibility. What these critics oppose. That's the grammatical subject. It's a clause, but it's embedded now and made into, to fill the slot that would be filled by a noun or a noun phrase. There are no references to the writer. Lexically dense noun phrases with heavy post-modification. Again, I've highlighted these in blue. A sensibility in revolt against the normalizing function of modernism. An attack on the canonization of modernism's rebellion. An attack on modernism's official status as the high culture of the modern capitalist world. Lexically dense noun phrases with a lot of heavy post-modification. This would make this piece then highly lexically dense. Quite a few examples of nominalized vocabulary. Verbs expressed as nouns. I've highlighted these in red. Notice how many there are. Circulation, beginnings, work, sensibility, pluralism, collapse. You can see the list. So what do we observe about writing? Well, as we have been saying, it involves a lot of nominalization, it involves a lot of embedding. It makes it lexically dense. Now, what do we mean when we're talking about nominalization? We're talking about nominalization, and what we're saying is that sort of by default, and remember we call this the relation of congruence, sort of that congruent way of connecting meaning and wording, semantics and grammar. We say we have things that are represented as nouns. If you have a quality of something, you represent it as an adjective. If you have a process, we say we represent it as a verb. This is the default. This is the, when you grow up, this is how you talk. And yes, that's how we write. We say, for example, and I highlighted here, the solvent tends to be drawn through. And I've said before, this is an example. Yes, it's highly verbal. It's verbs. To be drawn through, diluting. But the point is then this is then captured in a whole different way when this happening is turned into a something by turning the actions into the noun, movement. Now, what do we mean when we said this is a relation congruence, the default? We can connect up meaning and wording, and then we can redraw the line, and that redrawing of the line, what did we call that? We said that it's a kind of grammatical metaphor. And we do it all the time in writing. They educated girls, a clause, and then conjunction, joining this clause with another clause. Now that's why we say that spoken is verbal, and spoken is extending clause after clause, expanding clauses. It is more intricate in terms of the design here of putting together two ideas, connecting them up with a conjunction. But then this is all simplified into one clause as we turn these verbs into nouns. The education of girls, the acquisition of the vote by women, and when we use a verb to somehow show how there is a relation between these two events as things. We said that there's a shift. The verbs and adjectives are becoming nouns. Conjunctions are becoming replaced by verbs. And what were essentially combination of clauses now becomes a simple clause. And what were clauses before become groups or phrases, we could call them. We call this grammatical metaphor. Grammatical metaphor because what we're doing is we're taking one way in which we would normally talk in terms of processes or verbs, and we realign it. And this has become the basis for how we innovate in language. It is to make a metaphor, but not lexical metaphor, but a grammatical metaphor. Now, I don't want you to think that it's sort of plus or minus grammatical metaphor. Plus or minus the change between spoken and writing. It's not, that's a bit too simplistic to see it that way. Let me give you this first sentence as an example. Osmolarity increases. So putrescine is rapidly excreted. Now that is sort of like the way we would speak. It's verbs. Osmolarity increases. Putrescine is rapidly excreted. They're verbs, not nouns. And how are we relating it? With a conjunction. So we could say then that the relation between these two expresses sort of a cause and effect, but paratactically. Next sentence. Well, here we keep the idea of cause and effect, but we turn it into two clauses that are related through the because. And so that change using because makes it into a hypotactic construction. This because osmolarity increases, that's dependent. You must complete the thought. Putrescine is rapidly excreted. All right, still though we just changed from paratactic to hypotactic, that's all. But now suppose that what we do is we take two sort of rank shifted clauses. In other words, we turn these clauses into sort of like nouns. So we take that as that osmolarity increases has the effect that putrescine is rapidly excreted. we turned it into two that clauses, all right? So, and both of these sort of function like nouns. Now, both of those clauses are finite. What does that mean? That means they're being expressed with tense, primary tense, increases, present tense. Putrescine is excreted, all right? That is still present tense. But here we change that, and that could be made a bit even more abstract by talking about it in terms of non-finite action. Osmolarity increasing leads to putrescine being rapidly excreted. Again, two rank-shifted clauses, but now we've dropped the primary tense and we're just using the verb ing, non-finite. Okay, take it another step. Now we take these two nominal groups, increasing. Notice how instead of saying osmolarity increasing, we turn it around and we put the verb as the head. Increasing of osmolarity causes rapid excreting of putrescine. Previously, the noun was the head, all right? Osmolarity increasing. Now we turn the verb around as head. Now notice that what we're moving along is we're making it more and more abstract. It is becoming more, we could say, metaphorical at the same time. Now we have increase of osmolarity, rapid excretion of putrescine. We have no verb except the verb that connects these two nouns. Increase of osmolarity, nominal group, rapid excretion of putrescine, another nominal group, a mass noun as head, and related by just the verb causes. And notice we're not using a conjunction, we're using a verb. Increases of osmolarity cause rapid excretions of putrescine. What have we done to the noun, do you notice? We took a verb, we turned it into a noun. And what can you do with a noun? You can count it. You can't do that with a verb. You can't count verbs. You can count a noun. Increases, plural, make it plural. Because now it has become a thing. Now it has become a noun. And now we can pluralize it. It's a nominalizing grammar. Yes, it's given scientists, Halliday says, enormous power over their environment. So much so that they can make the world stand still or even create new virtual realities. You can take a verb, turn it into a noun, and even then make it into a plural. Scientists have used the resources that were available in language that they have been using since from the time of the early Greeks now through to people like Newton and Darwin, and changing the language as they went along. I gave you the example before of optics. And this, by the way, would have been an ideal example of the kind of, when we talk about a text unfolding, the logogenetic unfolding of a text, this would have been the ideal example. Because when Newton begins, he describes his experiments. Very little grammatical metaphor. The next step was when he started to make arguments and conclusions from these. And then the less intricate clause complexes, it's becoming less like the way one speaks. It becomes less the congruent, more the metaphorical, and we have some nominalizations that are being included. But then finally, when he starts to derive his mathematical formulations, they have one kind of formula, simple sentences, one clause only, where you have two lexically dense nominal groups related by some verb which expresses the relation between them. Now that is exactly what we've seen to be the language of science. It is the language of how we write. We nominalize our experience. We turn it into nouns. It's actions, it's happenings. We turn them into events, we turn them into things. Verbs now serve another purpose. They just signal the logical relation between happenings. A causes X, A proves X. And A and X are these dense, lexically dense nominal groups. And this has emerged, Halliday says, as the most highly valued model for scientific writing. This is how you write when you're writing. This is how you write for the language of science. Think about field, tenor, mode. Field, what are you talking about? What are you writing about? You are writing, that's the mode. This will have an impact on the way you write, and how you're writing, how what you're saying, how what you're communicating will be then evaluated. Is there an alternative? Well, let's see what this talk has to say about nominalization.
Take an adjective such as implacable, or a verb like proliferate, or even another noun, crony, and add a suffix such as ity or tion or ism. You've created a new noun: implacability, proliferation, cronyism. Sounds impressive, right? Wrong. You've just unleashed a flesh-eating zombie. Nouns made from other parts of speech are called nominalizations. Academics love them. So do lawyers, bureaucrats, business writers. I call them zombie nouns because they consume the living. They cannibalize active verbs. They suck the lifeblood from adjectives. And they substitute abstract entities for human beings. Here's an example. The proliferation of nominalizations in a discursive formation may be an indication of a tendency toward pomposity and abstraction. Huh? This sentence contains no fewer than 7 nominalizations, yet it fails to tell us who is doing what. When we eliminate or reanimate most of the zombie nouns, so tendency becomes tend, abstraction becomes abstract, then we add a human subject and some active verbs, the sentence springs back to life. Writers who overload their sentences with nominalizations tend to sound pompous and abstract. Only one zombie noun, the keyword nominalizations, has been allowed to remain standing. At their best, nominalizations help us express complex ideas, perception, intelligence, epistemology. At their worst, they impede clear communication. To get a feeling for how zombie nouns work, release a few of them into a lively sentence and watch them sap all its energy. George Orwell played this game in his essay, Politics and the English Language. He started with a well-known verse from the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible. It says, "I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill. But time and chance happeneth to them all." Now here's Orwell's modern English version. Objective considerations of contemporary phenomena compel the conclusion that success or failure in competitive activities exhibits no tendency to be commensurate with innate capacity, but that a considerable element of the unpredictable must invariably be taken into account. The Bible passage speaks to our senses and emotions with concrete nouns, descriptions of people, and punchy abstract nouns such as race, battle, riches, time, chance. Not a zombie among them. Orwell's satirical translation, on the other hand, is teeming with nominalizations and other vague abstractions. The zombies have taken over, and the humans have fled the village. Zombie nouns do their worst damage when they gather in jargon-generating packs and swallow every noun, verb, and adjective in sight. So globe becomes global, becomes globalized, becomes globalization. The grandfather of all nominalizations, anti-disestablishmentarianism, contains at least 2 verbs, 3 adjectives, and 6 other nouns inside its distended belly. A paragraph heavily populated by nominalizations will send your readers straight to sleep. Rescue them from the zombie apocalypse with vigorous, verb-driven sentences that are concrete and clearly structured. You want your sentences to live, not to join the living dead.
All right, so when do you nominalize? When do you not? Another point is that it's something that can be overdone, overloaded. But you have to keep in mind, there is an expectation also for how you will be able to express your ideas. So when you are writing, when you are thinking about the register, you think in terms of what is expected, but how can you make it more effective? Now, nominalizations can serve a useful purpose. And I illustrated this before with Donald Jung's speech. And you'll remember that at the conclusion, he drew out this particular sort of contrast. And as we said, when he made that contrast, he was in a way slanting it toward one way by his use of grammatical metaphor. He could have said, it reminds us. Why does he use it as a reminder? Now here, it has, to me, a significance. It has a meaning. When he shifted it to a reminder, he gave it a certain substance. He made it concrete. So you see, it's not as though all nominalizations are bad and zombie nouns. They can serve a very useful purpose, but the point is to be deliberate and to be careful and to be aware of what you are doing with the language and how you are writing and how well you're going to be understood. I think it's 1:45 now. I think we'll take a 10-minute break and see you back in about 10 minutes time, and we'll pick up from this point where we're talking about what is meaning, okay? Let's take a brief break now for about 10 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everybody. And I've just been asking the students who are in the classroom what they are planning to do their term paper on, and they all seem very well prepared and aware of what they're planning to do. That's great, and I hope that those of you who are listening in here are also have clear idea what it is you'd like to do and thinking about it, and I hope seeing I look forward to reading what you're going to be saying, so that would be great. What is meaning? We keep putting this word out there, and I hope that you have a pretty good idea what I mean by meaning. And what I mean is very much influenced by what Halliday says about meaning. And again, within the framework of systemic functional linguistics, what is meaning? It's how you see the world, how you perceive the world, how you understand what's happening. We call that ideational. Enacting relationships, how you relate to others, the interpersonal, and how you create the discourse. We called it the textual. Now, you should see a close relationship here between what we were saying about field, tenor, and mode, aligning themselves here with the different kinds of meaning. Ideational, what it's about, how you construe the world. Interpersonal, those tenor relationships, how you relate to one to the other. And how that discourse actually materializes, whether it's in spoken, whether it's something spoken or whether it's something written. Ideational, interpersonal, textual. Halliday, you remember, he says it is a system that isn't just that it is semiotic, it is semogenic. It makes meaning. So how does it make meaning? It makes meaning whenever you have choice. You have a choice, and in doing so, you can choose to say it one way or choose not to say it another way. And just like we saw with Donald Jung just a moment ago, he could say to remind, or he could say reminder. He's making a choice, and in making that choice, he's making meaning. We call these the metafunctions. So when I talk about what are the metafunctions of language, we're talking about these, the ideational, the interpersonal, the textual. We broke it down into sort of components. And when we talked about ideational, we said there's two components here. One is the reflecting on the world around you. How you see it is what's happening, how is it being presented in terms of who are the doers, who are the initiators, who's affected, what's the process, the verb or the action that's involved. Logical, how those ideas connect up one to the other. The interpersonal, enacting a social relationship, how we relate, and how does meaning materialize? And how does it do so grammatically? And I want you to be thinking in terms of grammar. Grammar in this sense of how meaning is turned into the way we actually communicate. How it's turned into wording. And so when we talk about the experiencing of the world, how did we do so? What's the experiential? What kinds of processes are taking place? Who initiated the processing? Who is affected by it? What are the circumstances? Just focusing then here on the ideational, the experiential, and the logical. Logical, how are ideas connected? Are there dependent clauses? Are they independent clauses? Is it hypotactic or is it paratactic? These terms, I hope that you're familiar with and you're looking at it and aware of these when it comes to looking at the text and understanding, how does it come out to be art or inventive or inspiring? Now, Halliday distinguished process types into various types, and this we have used in terms of our analysis too. So think about it in this sense. Is it doing? Is it sensing, knowing, seeing, feeling, mental? Or is it saying something, verbal? Or behavioral, like coughing or sleeping or behaving? And these would be just single one participant processes. Existential, there is, there are. Relational, being, becoming, having. We've identified these groups of processes. Now, Halliday said thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. So when you think about what's a doing process, what does that mean? You know, we really distinguish it grammatically. And to elaborate on what that means is, let's think of it in terms of these questions. What did X do? What did X do to Y? Can you ask those questions? John kicked the ball. Can you say, what did John do? He kicked the ball. What did John do to the ball? He kicked it. Yes, fine. Does it matter whether the initiator is human or non-human? Doesn't matter. The car hit the tree. But it cannot project an idea. It cannot, for example, you cannot assign a that clause to a doing process. You can't say John kicked the ball. So then those are doing processes. But what's the difference then between knowing, seeing, feeling? Well, for those, you can't say, what did X do? John saw the bird. If I said, what did John do? And you answer me, John saw the bird. That makes no sense. It's not a doing. And you can't say, what did John do to the bird? He saw it. Again, it's not a seeing. It's not a doing kind of process. And the initiator has to be human, or at least human-like, or a sense of consciousness to be able to think and to sense. And it can project. It can, John saw that I was cold. It can take a that clause that is giving some additional idea of what phenomena was that I saw. But then what about verbal processes? Can I, John, if I say, what did John do? He told a joke. Fine, no problem. If I say, what did John do to the joke? He told it. Cannot say that. This is what I mean when I say that these processes behave differently in the grammar, in the way we use language. You can have a non-human or a human initiator, not like a mental process. But like a mental process, it can take a that clause. John told us that we should leave. So we have each one of these process types somehow behaves differently, just using these, applying these three tests. Relational processes. What did John do? John is smart. No, cannot ask that question. It's not doing. It can be non-human, it can be human. John is tall, the building is tall. It can even take a that clause. John's view is that all is well. And so we see this kind of, the processes are not just different meaning-wise, they're different in the way that we use the language. Who can be the participant? Whether you can substitute it with the verb do. Can it take a that clause? These are the sort of the tests to determine what kind of process type it is. Now, we applied that in looking at Donald Jung and Susan Rice. For Donald Jung, remember, we noticed that it was, the doing was being done not by people, but by events and things. Susan Rice, the doing was done largely by people. Very different way of seeing the world, a very different perception of the world. I'd like to take a look more at Susan Rice's commencement speech that she gave at Stanford. This is the word cloud that you can see. Now, Susan Rice was, when she gave it, she was the UN representative from the United States. She went on to become Obama's national security advisor. She was one of those considered by Biden to be his vice president. She probably will have a role in the Biden presidency for sure. What did we notice about her use of language? We said that if we break it up into sensing, being, doing. Now, how did I break those apart? Sensing, being, doing, grammatically, how they behave. And the doing, if I just look at that and I look at it in terms of the ER role, what do I mean the ER role? What's the ER role? It's the who is the initiator? Who is the doer? Who is the sensor? Who is the thinker? Who is the sayer? And we notice that in terms of who is the E in the ER role, 80% was people, I, you, we, and half of the speech was about doing. So looking at it from the standpoint of process, participant, circumstance, we call that transitivity. We're looking at the way that we construe the world. That is already saying something about the speech itself. And if we add up everything, 71% of every kind of activity is being done by I, you, we.
So much change has transpired just in my adult lifetime, and you will see so much more in yours. But it doesn't just happen. Progress is the product of human agency. Things get better because we make them better. And things go wrong when we get too comfortable, when we fail to take risks or seize opportunities. Never trust that the abstract forces of history will end a war, or that luck will cure a disease, or that prayers alone will save a child. If you want change, you have to make it. If we want progress, we have to drive it.
Okay, so if I were asking you a question like, show me how and illustrate how the way in which we construe the world through language plays a role in terms of how we are expressing it in terms of the speeches, for example, that we give, what we say, how that reflects our ideology of the world. How does our ideology come through in our language? Well, let's take this part here. All right, now this is the end of her speech. It's different than the one I just played for you. This is the end of her speech. Now let's take a look. Do we notice anything about this speech? Now, if on an exam, for example, if I gave you a part of a text and I asked you to notice what there was in terms of the use of language that seemed to coincide with the way in which we would expect one to speak in that situation. In other words, what is the register here? The register is a commencement speech, a motivation speech. And in that particular commencement speech, what is it that you're talking about? Who are you talking to? What is the mode of communication? Now, what do you notice about the text here? Let's listen to it.
And finally, as you're changing the world, never neglect family. They're not just your foundation. They're the source of life's greatest fulfillment, as all the parents here can testify. Both my parents were recently struck by serious illnesses. My colleagues were tremendous about stepping in for me at the halls of the United Nations. But nobody could step in for me or my brother at the hospital. There's usually someone else who can do your job, but there's nobody else who can be a loving child or a devoted parent. Like those before you, your generation will contribute. It will innovate, and it will serve in unique ways. But today, change is coming faster than ever, and you must shape that change. You can be that change, not for an election, but for a lifetime. If you remember nothing else of what I said, try to remember that little boy. Remember that he is somebody's beloved son. Remember that he counts as much as any of us. Remember that we cannot afford to sleep easy while he suffers. Remember that you can make his life better. Above all, remember that each of us has a profound responsibility to try with all of our skill, all of our smarts, and all of our soul. So make him safe, make progress, and make us proud. Congratulations again, and Godspeed.
All right, now, if I take a look at the processes that are used here, and I'm looking at it in terms of the I, you, and we, and anything else other, she's talking, I. You occurs more frequently, all right? It's in doing and thinking and being. We, not as much. Other things mentioned? Yes, 13 things are mentioned, all right? So who is the initiator here? Well, you could say other things. And what's the focus then? Well, come back to the logical. I want to take a look at what we've just been looking at in terms of also the logical. That's also part of the ideational. Remember, we said that the logical includes the dependent clauses and how the clauses are combined together. What does that mean? Well, we broke it down. We compared hypotaxis and parataxis. I hope you are clear on both of those concepts. What is hypotaxis? Where there is a sort of asymmetrical relationship. One is more important. We could say more, it is the core. It is the nucleus. We'll identify it as the alpha clause. And then you have the other clause, which sort of, and we drew an arc to show that it is somehow related to that alpha clause. It's the beta clause. It's elaborating. It's doing something with respect to that main clause. A parataxis just sort of strings them along together, adds clauses together. John enjoys reading and he likes swimming. And what we said was that you could take those two logical relations and look at how they support then, whether it's elaborating, giving additional information, whether it's just simply extending using like a conjunction, whether it's qualifying it in terms of some aspect of where, when, why, how, enhancing, or projecting. Projecting is what? Well, we see that in direct speech. Tom said, and then in quotes, I'll be away next week. Those we would say is a projecting kind of relationship that is paratactic. Then you have indirect speech, Tom said, and then you follow that with a that clause. So these are the kinds of logical relations, whether paratactic or hypotactic. Meaning, is it symmetrical or asymmetrical? And then whether it's elaborating, extending, enhancing, projecting. Now go back to look at this speech. What would you say in terms of this closing? Anything that one could observe about the use of language here in terms of the logical? Well, I highlighted certain points here. What do you see in terms of, if you look at the red, what's the red? And finally, as you're changing the world, never neglect family. As all parents here can testify. If, or the use of those conjunctions, as, if, while, those are hypotactic. You have a dependent clause and you have a main clause. Not so much, you notice, not much hypotaxis here. What about in blue? They're not just your foundation, they're the source of life's greatest fulfillment. But nobody could step in for me or for my brother in clause 115, but there's nobody else. Paratactic. Well, there's more parataxis here. Not so much hypotaxis. We do have some embedding. I identified that with green, not much though. But go back down. What do you see that really stands out? What do you see that really makes an impression? Well, one thing that you should notice is the remember, remember, remember. Repeated. But not just the repetition of the verb remember. What kind of clause is this? It's an imperative. It's a command. Remember, remember, remember. How many times? 1, 2. Well, also in the hypotaxis as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 times repeating this remember. The repetition, it is the imperative which commands you to this is what you should be doing. And then finally, the last one, again, that power of 3. Make him safe, make progress, make us proud. All 3 imperatives, all 3 the same. Make, make, make. It is the repetition. It is the imperatives. Those are what you expect, and those are what you see when you look at a speech like this. Motivating. You're motivating. What are you trying to do? You're trying to get somebody to do something. And so your speech is trying to motivate, and that motivation is going to have to include an imperative. What you need to do, because the speech is all about trying to get you to do something. Now, what I did here was I just laid out what was the sort of, whether it was paratactic or hypotactic. On the left side, you see the parataxis. Now, it's just what I've highlighted before in blue. And what you see when I highlighted it in red just now for those clauses, that's what you see on the right-hand side, the hypotaxis. But what stands out here is that you have parataxis, and then toward the end, where is the hypotaxis coming from? It's largely that projection, because remember that, remember that. That is what gives a lot of the that clauses. And the enhancement is as you do this, if you do this, while you do this. It is all sort of qualifying it in terms of time, where, when, why. So let me add up a few things then. I have 7 simple clauses. And then I have 25 clauses which are part of a clause complex, either paratactic or hypotactic. So I'll add up and I have 32 clauses. Now, of those simple clauses, 3 are imperatives. Of those clauses that are part of a clause complex, 25, 7 are imperatives. 10 clauses are imperative. Fully a third of what we've just seen. A third of it was imperatives, doing, telling you what to do. So go back then and look, who is the focus of this? If we just looked at it in terms of the processes as who's doing what, well, imperatives don't say you, but they're inferred. And if we added those in here, what we would see is that there is a great deal more you. You is largely the focus of this speech. Largely the focus, especially because what we've been analyzing is the closing here. When she gets to the closing, now do you remember Steve Jobs, and remember how did he close? It was changing it to you. The focus changes to you. That's how in a motivation speech, perhaps the beginning is about yourself, but in the end it is about the person to whom you're speaking and what you are trying to motivate them to get to do. Here's her speech in full. Let's listen to it.
Stanford University.
Good morning, Stanford. Thank you very much, President Hennessy, for that very warm introduction. It is wonderful to be back at Stanford. Having gotten around a bit over the last few years, I am more convinced than ever that this is the best university on the face of the planet. It's particularly gratifying to be back in this stadium, which is a rather special place for me. It happens to be the spot where my husband and I had our first romantic moment. It was just as the band was playing All Right Now. But my kids are in the audience, so I'm not going to give you any more detail. Stanford has had an enormous impact on my life. Not only is it where I met my husband, but it's where I met the people, took the courses, and championed the causes that ultimately led me to a career in international affairs. Stanford also taught me focus and discipline. Once you've learned to study in a bathing suit on the grass with muscled men throwing frisbees over your head, you can accomplish almost anything. Let me join President Hennessy in recognizing the parents here today. For many families, you kids have been living far away from home. I grew up in Washington, D.C., as you heard, and it is not a lie to say that I think my mother just got over my decision to come to Stanford about 3 weeks ago. I still understand the pride that you have in your children must know no bounds. You've made enormous sacrifices to enable your kids to get such a tremendous education. So this is your day too. Parents, grandparents, family, and friends, thank you for all you have done. Now, class of 2010, first and foremost, congratulations. I suspect you're feeling pretty good about yourselves. I remember feeling pretty good about myself, too, when I was sitting in your seats. In fact, I might have been feeling a little bit too good, judging from how much I remember of my commencement speech. Hold on to this jubilant moment and cherish your memories of this extraordinary place. Nurture the friendships you've made here. The warmth and security of Stanford can sustain you as you face an economy still climbing out of a deep hole and as you enter a world changing at a furious pace. Imagine the world and what it will be like when one of you comes back a quarter century from now to deliver the commencement address. In 1986, when I graduated, the Soviet Union was bristling with 45,000 nuclear weapons, and the Berlin Wall was impenetrable. Nelson Mandela was clocking his 23rd year in prison in apartheid South Africa. Osama bin Laden was fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan, and Al-Qaeda didn't exist. Almost nobody had heard of global warming. Japan was the daunting economic powerhouse, and China's share of global gross domestic product was 2%. There were some 30 fewer countries in the world and 2 billion fewer people on the planet. We've seen amazing technological advances. In 1986, only 0.2% of the US population had a cell phone, which were bricks about 10 inches long. IBM announced its first laptop, which weighed 12 pounds. 24-hour cable news was in its infancy. The face of America has changed too. In 1986, 8% of the US population was Hispanic. Today, it's about 15%. The number of African Americans serving in Congress has doubled, and the number of women and Latinos has tripled. And if on my graduation day, someone had told me that I would live to see the first African American president, much less serve in his cabinet, I would have asked them what they were smoking. So much change has transpired just in my adult lifetime, and you will see so much more in yours. But it doesn't just happen. Progress is the product of human agency. Things get better because we make them better, and things go wrong when we get too comfortable, when we fail to take risks or seize opportunities. Never trust that the abstract forces of history will end a war, or that luck will cure a disease, or that prayers alone will save a child. If you want change, you have to make it. If we want progress, we have to drive it. Technology and trade help transform a bipolar world into the deeply interconnected global community of the 21st century. Yet the planet is still divided by fundamental inequalities. Some of us live in peace, freedom, and comfort, while billions are condemned to conflict, poverty, and repression. These massive disparities erode our common security and corrode our common humanity. We cannot afford to live in contempt of each other's welfare. It's not just wrong, it's dangerous. When a country is racked by war or weakened by want, its people suffer first. But poor and fragile states can incubate threats that spread far beyond borders: terrorism, pandemic disease, nuclear proliferation, criminal networks, climate change, genocide, and more. In our interconnected age, a threat to development anywhere is a threat to security everywhere. That makes the fight against global poverty not only one of the great moral challenges of all time, but also one of the great national security challenges of our time. So here's my challenge to you. Become agents of change. Be driven by a passion to lift up the most vulnerable and to serve those with the least, both at home and around the world. For me, for so many reasons, this is a personal as well as a professional imperative. One of those reasons is a little boy whom I met in war-ravaged Angola in 1995. I don't even know his name. He was one face in a friendly mob of destitute little kids who greeted our delegation at a dusty camp for internally displaced persons in the middle of nowhere. He was perhaps 3 or 4 years old, with pencil-thin legs and a distended belly, and only a torn t-shirt to wear. But he stood out because he had the most amazingly infectious smile. I walked up to him before realizing that the only thing I had to give him was the worn baseball cap that I was wearing. I took it off and put it gently on his head. The joy on his face remains etched in my mind to this day. But I had to leave that camp, and when I did, I left that little boy in hell. I like to think, and I sure hope, that kid is okay. But he could well have become one of the 9 million children under the age of 5 who die each year, mostly from preventable and treatable afflictions. Yet he has every right to live with the same dignity, hope, and security that my own son enjoys. They're both children of God, of equal worth, equal consequence, and equal rights. That little boy's future is tied to ours. Our security is ultimately linked to his well-being. So we must shape the world that he deserves. That child deserves a world without the poverty that crushes the dreams of hundreds of millions. Half of humanity lives on less than $2.50 a day. That child deserves a world without extreme hunger and dependence that it fosters. So we are investing in building poor countries' capacity to feed themselves. Agricultural research has produced stronger crops that yield more, adapt faster, and better resist drought, disease, and pests. Yet Africa's crop production remains the lowest in the world. With your generation's leadership and ingenuity, you can make it the highest. That child deserves a world where everyone can get a quality education. More than 70 million kids are not enrolled in primary school today, and 60% of them are girls. You can help close this gap by joining Teach for America here at home or the Peace Corps abroad, by providing lunches for rural girls' schools, by working to end child labor, forced marriage, and human trafficking, and by creating educational systems that reach all of our children. That child deserves a world in which we find new cures for old plagues. You can be the generation to develop new vaccines for tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS, to use nanotechnology to create smart therapies that kill cancer cells and leave their healthy neighbors untouched, to provide needle-free immunizations to stop pandemics in their tracks. That child deserves a world whose climate is not collapsing, whose air isn't choked by soot, and whose waters aren't polluted with spewing oil. Imagine deploying clean energy technologies to poor countries to power development without fossil fuels. Much as China and Africa largely skipped landlines and leapfrogged to cell phones. You can be the generation that makes a green economy reality, that turns the fight against climate change into a boon for the developing world, not just a burden. You can be the generation that actually reverses global warming. That child, and every child, deserves a world of greater opportunity, democracy, and hope. And that is the world you can help forge. Sometimes we innovate in great strides. Sometimes we progress by slow and steady advances, but progress we must. The fight against poverty is a challenge worthy of your generation that grew up in this interlinked age. The goal of a world free of famine and mass misery may seem distant, but once so were the moon and the microchip. The aim is ambitious, but so are you. As you go about changing the world, continuously challenge yourselves. Get out of your comfort zone. Go try.
Okay, now, were you noticing anything about the way in which she was structuring that speech? You notice the parts where she said, that child deserves, that child deserves. She was now structuring her speech in a way that was repetitive, yes, but it was that repetition gave you a sense of the various parts to which she was then going to be elaborating about what kind of world hopefully these students would be able to produce in the future. There's a lot of it which is her personal story, her identifying this child, and then that leading up to talking about that child and every child. And finally, the closing that we just took a look at before. And that's where I've stopped it here. Remember at the end where she says, remember, remember that child. That's the child she's speaking to. So throughout that speech, there is a thread. The thread begins with her talking about that personal experience that she had with that little poor child that she came across. And then leading that into a more general statement about what she hopes for the world. Now, if you listen to it, there's also a great deal of nominalization, because it does sound very, very much like it has been written. It is very scripted, it's very planned. How effective is that speech? Did she get her point across? Is it a speech that would be inspiring, that would be memorable? Let's go on to look at that, and we're going to come back to something, and I'm going to be talking about comparing her speech with some other speeches as well. The second exam question was this: explain the linguistic notions of interpersonal meaning and modality as presented in this course. And again, I ask you to discuss and illustrate with examples from the lecture how one's use of modality may contribute to interpersonal meaning. When I talked about interpersonal meaning, I was talking about what we called mood structure. And this is, are you giving statements? Are you giving questions? Are you making offers? Are you giving commands? And that is indicated by the grammar. It is, if it is a kind of statement, it is the subject precedes the finite verb. John bought bread. If it is a question, you reverse the order. If it is a command, you simply delete the finite and the subject. In other words, in English, there is a way for us to indicate whether we are asking for information or giving information or demanding that something be done. And all of it revolves around the use of the grammatical subject and the finite verb, their sequencing or their presence or absence. Now, when do you notice that there are a lot of imperatives? If I take this example of online help documentation, now come back to the point of when we talked about register. In help documentation, what is the context of situation? The context is the person working with that software has a problem and needs to find a solution for that problem and goes to the help to get that solution. Well, what is the help that is to be provided? Well, very often it is made up of a series of action statements. Now, what's the structure of those action statements? They're not declaratives. They're not questions. They're imperatives. They're telling you what to do. And in this context, this is what you want. You want to be told what you should be doing. In a commencement speech, you have a lot of imperatives. this speaker, who is supposed to have a certain authority and experience, is in a position to tell you what you should be doing. And so the imperatives are here. That is what you expect. That's what you want. You want to be told what to do in a series. Open the right file, double click this, edit that, choose this. Now, this is what you want, and this is what you expect. And this is because it's motivated by the nature of the task to be carried out. Besides mood, though, besides whether it's a statement or a question or a command, an imperative, declarative, interrogative, modality. Now, I'd like you to listen to part of a speech that was given by Hu Jintao. And this speech that was given by Hu Jintao was on the occasion of his White House visit. And this was the welcome ceremony. And I'm going to play a bit of Hu Jintao's speech to you. I want you to be noticing something related to the use of modality. You'll speak in Chinese and it'll be translated.
总统先生、奥巴马夫人、女士们、先生们、朋友们，很高兴应奥巴马总统的邀请，在议员胡适的时期来到华盛顿，对美国进行国事访问。此时此刻，我谨代表13亿中国人民，向美国人民致以诚挚的问候和良好的祝愿。
Mr. President, Mrs. Obama, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it gives me great pleasure to come to Washington and pay a state visit to the United States at the beginning of the new year at the invitation of President Obama. At this point in time, let me extend, on behalf of the 1.3 billion Chinese people, sincere greetings and best wishes to the people of the United States.
All right, now I'm not going to play the whole speech. This is the nature of the speech, but I want you to notice something about that speech. At the very beginning, he is addressing who? Obama, Mrs. Obama, ladies and gentlemen. It's rather first person, me, I have come. Well, that sort of stops by paragraph 3, and paragraph 3 is sort of the history over the past 32 years as we enter the second decade of the 21st century. But what I want to draw your attention to is paragraph 5. What do you see repeated? We should. And then he goes on in 6, 7, 8, and 9 to repeat the same thing. Our cooperation as partners should be based. Our cooperation as partners should be based. And he repeats this 4 times. Who is in a position to tell someone else what should be the case? Someone who senses themselves in a feeling of authority. What is the who in this? Very rarely do we notice one of these sort of like welcome ceremonies for a visiting dignitary. Very rarely in these speeches do you notice the use of modality like this. We should. In a way, it's sort of saying what is expected, not just even what is expected, what is in a way sort of the outcome and what that outcome should be. Is there a sense of obligation that he puts on what should be the outcome? In other words, the use of modality is interesting because in a way it reflected a kind of relationship that where Hu Jintao was in the position to be telling Obama what should be the case. And this was a very interesting kind of relationship that was being sort of established by the use of modality. We notice in Obama's speech, we looked at this example before, and his use of should, in pointing finger. And he was telling Congress what should be done. And then the indication of certainty, will. But this reflects the use of modal auxiliaries is interesting because it reflects the attitude. It reflects the attitude of the speaker to the hearer. It reflects their relationship, the nature of that relationship. Now, when you come to looking at the continuous participation task, I've asked you to look at examples of commencement motivation speeches. Steve Jobs, David Foster Wallace, Denzel Washington, Susan Rice. And I want you to, I said, please identify some typical linguistic features of these commencement, of these motivation speeches. Interestingly, Time magazine ranked these commencement speeches. And do you notice what were the top two commencement speeches? The top one was David Foster Wallace. The second one was Steve Jobs. It's David Foster Wallace. I mentioned him before, and we looked at a video that was taken from the talk that he gave. There's a movie I mentioned, and we looked at that movie, and one of the points that was made is David Foster Wallace, a few years, I think it was about 2 or 3 years after giving this commencement speech, committed suicide. We looked at an excerpt from this, which was turning his speech into a video. It was called "This is Water." And you remember what we said about that speech. We were looking at it, and this comes back to the point about the process, participant, circumstance. We saw that the speech could almost be divided into sort of 3 parts. The first part was more active: take, get, want. The second part was more highly relational processes. It was describing something. Think came up here. And think was really the one that became obvious in the last sort of segment. In these 3 segments, then, there seems to be a direction in which the process types are taking. We notice less doing and more thinking, more mental. Now, what was David Foster Wallace in his speech trying to more or less be able to motivate his audience? What was the motivation for? It was how they were to think. Not so much what they were to do, but how they were to think. Another aspect, and I'll come to the final exam question because that will be related to what I'm talking about also here. Explain the linguistic notions of theme and thematic progression. Discuss and illustrate with examples how linguistic notions of theme and thematic progression contribute to the listener's, reader's response to the speaker, writer. What do we mean by the textual aspect of meaning? We said it relates to how the message is organized, and we said that how you begin each sentence, how you begin each clause, that's what we call theme. It is the starting point of the message. It's what the speaker wants to talk about. It fits this clause within the context of what else is being said. And over the progress of the text, as it progresses, we see how the text develops, very much through the choices about how each clause or sentence begins. I illustrated it with this. John's already left. Yesterday, time. His spirit, the complement, that's been put first. It could be a noun phrase with an embedded clause, people who live in glass houses, the grammatical subject. There are other things that can also be put there at the beginning. What else is theme? But textually relates to what preceded it. Mary, I'm talking to Mary. And that I is the idea of what you're talking about. I do love your cooking. And I talked about the idea of thematic progression, how we progress through the clause and the choices that we make, and a kind of progression which is where the new information, which comes later in the clause, becomes how you begin the next clause. The new information becomes old, it's spoken, and that is how you begin the next. So in the genesis of the City Polytechnic of Hong Kong, the new information in the report of a committee now becomes theme of what follows in the second sentence. The same idea, there should be a general increase in the substantial increase in the provision of places for tertiary education. One of the measures recommended for achieving this refers back to what had been mentioned in the new information of 2B. So there is a new information at the end of one clause becomes the theme of the next clause. It's already been said. Or you can keep repeating the same thing throughout. That's a continuous thematic progression. But when we came to looking at David Foster Wallace's, on the top row, notice those are the themes, the choices of theme. And what do you notice about the first section? You. What do you notice about the last section? You. You is focuses on you at the end and at the beginning. But what about the middle? In the middle, it's I. And you remember what he was talking about was the sort of how you go through life and how you experience life. And the second part was more or less a rather, you can look at it in a rather negative way. But he doesn't say you, he's saying I. He attributes the negativity to himself. Looking at his commencement speech then, let's listen to that commencement speech. I want you to notice something that was said. Time magazine wrote this. This address at Kenyon was vintage Wallace, a smart, occasionally meandering discussion of the issues that consumed him, from the banality of life to the meaning of consciousness. I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy and grandly inspirational, he concluded. What it is, so far as I can see, is the truth. The capital T truth is about life before death. It is about the making it to 30 or maybe 50 without wanting to shoot yourself in the head. That's a very different commencement style speech, definitely. So I want to play this as sort of the anti what one would expect in terms of commencement speech. As the Time magazine says, all the reasons Wallace didn't make it to 50 are apparent here. In hindsight, the speech reads like the first draft of a suicide note for an author who took his own life last year at age 46. While it's a macabre read, there's tons that's worthwhile here. The speech crackles with wit and intelligence and offers tricks for escaping the depression to which Wallace ultimately succumbed. So, okay, coming back, what I've been hoping to do today and is trying to sort of relate what we've been looking at in terms of kinds of meaning, ideational, interpersonal, textual, and how that is realized in terms of language, to applying that to the analysis of these motivation, commencement speeches, and so forth. And with the hope that what you're seeing and what you're getting an idea of is how you could apply that to other texts as well. But the focus today, it remains on these commencement speeches. David Foster Wallace, a writer who's been described as impenetrable, and his famous work, Infinite Jest, the difficulties that he had later in trying to come up with another major work, perhaps, plus his own experiencing depression. You'll remember what I explained to you previously, and that was that he had gone off his medication because he was feeling that was hindering his creativity, and as a result, he did commit suicide. But it is his own attitude toward life comes through in this particular commencement speech that I've mentioned before. And in this part, this is just one extract. This is water. It's just one part of the whole commencement speech. I hope that you got the point I'm making about how the speech, the extract that we're looking at, this is water, and perhaps you remember it, you'll hear a bit of it in what's coming up. that video put together sort of parts of his commencement speech. But in so doing, what they did was, and I feel it sort of reflects the sort of progression of his ideas. And as I mentioned, the beginning is about what one's life is like, and the humdrum life that one carries out, and but then how one can see that negatively, but reflected here by the choices that he's making. The choices of the verbs reflect the way the text is progressing. It is about how you think. And it also, as I mentioned, in terms of looking at theme, I hope theme is a clear concept. If any of you have difficulty with that concept, please let me know and I'll go into it in more detail. But it was in terms of looking at the various choices that he's making here. What has struck me and was where he is negative, where he sees the world in a negative way, where he contrasts that with what he wants, how he wants you to see it. He attributes it to his own thinking. So let's take a look at what is this speech that crackles with wit and intelligence, as Time magazine writes, but which is at the same time reading like the first draft of a suicide note. Very much of a contrast here, right? It's very much different than what we have been seeing in terms of Susan Rice, and even what we saw with Steve Jobs. It's not the typical commencement speech. He says that, and in a way he seemed to be eager to avoid it. It's not, I don't take it like the Time magazine describe it as sort of a suicide note. I don't take it that way either. It's strangely what he regards as something he himself says non-inspirational, but do you find it inspirational? I'd be interested in your responding to it. How do you respond to this differently than to Susan Rice's commencement speech, for example? Was this more addressed to you personally, and that one less so? That's how I found it. That's how I felt about it. But interestingly, Time magazine regarded it as the top commencement speech. Steve Jobs' speech, on the other hand, comes in second. We looked at Steve Jobs' speech last week, and in that speech, we were noticing, again, with David Foster Wallace, he is a writer, and he's bringing his craft to a kind of inspiration, which is perhaps not the same kind of inspiration of what we usually think of in a commencement speech. Not so much telling you what to do, but telling you how to think. In the case of Steve Jobs, yes, it was crafted also, and we obviously saw things repeated in threes, and we see that in Susan Rice's commencement speech. It's a common technique that is used in speeches. Repeat things in threes. The antithesis, the juxtaposition of contrasting words, the use of a parallel structure, repeating in a parallel structure. If you take a look back at Susan Rice's, you'll also notice a great deal of parallel structures repeated throughout. Steve Jobs' speech was different because it dealt with three stories. Well, stories, one's personal stories, do enter into it. With David Foster Wallace, though, where was the story? His story. No, there was no his story. It was not very much first person. This is something I've gone through. With Steve Jobs, yes. With Susan Rice, yes. It's very much related to their personal stories. But David Foster Wallace was not doing that. We looked at in terms of the kinds of processes that were used, and noticed that the stories differed in terms of what more or less control the first person, I, had in terms of what was being done. And whereas the first story was very much in his control, we noticed that sort of got less and less, with story 2 about his firing and story 3 about his experience of cancer. Parataxis, hypotaxis, we notice that it has the same sort of kind of proportion of parataxis, hypotaxis as we would see in any other speech that was written and drafted beforehand, not a spontaneous speech. But I find with David Foster Wallace and with Steve Jobs, both there is that casualness that comes through. And there is much less nominalization than we noticed in Susan Rice's speech, for example. But there's an architecture. There's a very clear architecture. There's a clear design that goes through Steve Jobs' speech. And he signals this, like in the first part where he says the first story is connecting the dots. He introduces it. Notice the next one, in 3, I dropped out the 3rd paragraph out of Reed College, but then stayed on. So why did I drop out? The posing of those questions, the questions themselves are posed in a way to get you to, they will be answered in what follows. You are to be interested in why did I drop out? Well, here's the question. Then he gives you the answer. There is a kind of elaboration as he goes through. There's that conclusion in 9, paragraph 9, where he comes back to it's about you. Why did I drop out? He answers the question. And this thematic progression, someday go to college, that's how he ends it. That's what he's talking about. And then you'll notice in paragraph 5, and 17 years later, I did go to college. So where he left off is where he picks it up in the next paragraph. The design of this leads one to realize that there is a kind of structure. There's an architecture. In paragraph 6, he ends, let me give you an example. Obviously, what follows then in 7 and 8 is his example. So he asks questions. He offers, let me give you an example. These are statements that allow him to give you an idea as to how he's signaling to you what is the architecture of his speech. Okay, we've looked at a number of commencement speeches, inspirational. They're different. What set apart David Foster Wallace's and Steve Jobs? What do you think put them in that category of being the top 2 in Times Magazine's evaluation? What do you think prompted that evaluation? What was there about what they were saying? What was there about how they said it that made that evaluation? How did you respond to it? How did you evaluate it? How did you see those commencement speeches? Listening to Susan Rice compared to David Foster Wallace, Steve Jobs, which of these influenced you? Which inspired you? And what would you say was the reason for why you responded? I want you to go away from this sort of looking at, yeah, this is what a commencement speech is like. In that sort of situation, what you would expect. You would expect it to be sort of a personal story. You would expect it to be rather first person by someone with some sense of experience and authority. But transitioning then into you and addressing the audience and in a way trying to impact on the audience. So the first person will change into the second person. And it is to motivate, so there will be the use of imperatives. That is to be expected. You're to motivate to do something. What is it that you're to be motivated to do? So the motivation, you have the imperative. You have the change from first person to second person. What about other aspects of their speeches that made you respond the way you did? They all have those elements, but what other elements were there that made them either similar or different from one another, and in some cases, more or less effective? All right, so we'll stop there for today. There's another one that before we finish this sort of topic, commencement speeches, there's another one I want to talk about and take a look at the language that's used, and that comes from Denzel Washington. But we'll look at that next time. Okay, so that's it for today, and we'll stop there and see you next week.